next memoir is Parallax, or How I Became a Great Poet. This is more in the vein of your didactic memoirs, and I mentioned that in a previous segment about how this particular true life of La Vida Nova is more didactic than the previous true life incarnations. This one talks about the evolution of greatness, and perhaps we can discuss that a bit.
What page is it?
Greatness. It's the next page. It's on page 200.
Okay.
And greatness isn't a permanent thing. It evolves, and the more greats that come about and expand the artistic cosmos, the more lessened the previous ones will be in many ways. T.S. Eliot, you mentioned here, could have been considered a great poet at one point because he has 5 or 6 poems that are at least arguably great. But with your passage, it kind of becomes more of a hit and miss thing in his regard. He can still be considered a good poet, but claims of greatness would be sort of absurd when you're comparing 6 to 1,000.
Yeah.
Also talk about the idea of greater than transcendence as its recognition, because many great poets of yore, well, they have 40 to 50 or 70 great poems as Rilke does. They don't seem to fully understand. It becomes much more instinctual things. You'll see this as evidence in how they praise lesser poets than them as their equals. Talk about the idea of greater than transcendence as its recognition.
A better example is in film with Ingmar Bergman is probably the typical example. I mean, Bergman was probably one of the great screenplay writers, if not the greatest screenplay writer of the 20th century. He's probably easily within the top 10 of filmmakers. Certainly, arguably, maybe the best European filmmaker. And yet, if you listen to him, he seems to have no fucking clue about what constitutes greatness in other filmmakers like an Antonioni, who's very similar to him in a lot of ways. And he'll praise in his later years someone like Spielberg. You know, you get.
Do you think Orson Welles was also in that vein? Because he would go and decry against Ingmar Bergman and Michelangelo Antonioni, although I think perhaps that may have been more of his typical bullshitting.
Yeah, and I when you listen to it, it's clear that Bergman doesn't really understand Antonioni. I think Wells was just a dick waver, and I think so. I don't put that on the same kind of thing. Although you know it may have been the idea, for example. I don't totally buy it since during his lifetime Kubrick never expressed a great admiration for Spielberg in public. Only after Kubrick died did Spielberg come out with this crap. But it's certainly not out beyond the pale that could have been. You know, I talk here. What about the Adrienne Rich? You know, she's one of the great no talents out there. Let's see who else I got here. Magritte Nude Reclining.
Well, it will get into the various approaches too that you can use in something. You can take something like the guy driving in the sewer pipe between Forest Park and Cypress Hill Cemetery, and then how the same event is taken in 12th Murder, The Roundness Comes Later, and how you can make it into something entirely different. Then you'll mention about how Rilke, well, you couldn't necessarily recapitulate all his great poems as you couldn't with Whitman or Crane or Jeffers. How poetry itself, which is a poem in the Rilke vein, isn't something that Rilke could have written himself either. It's too complex and it uses imagery in ways that Rilke never did. His was more, you know, a clipped kind of style with a spiritual end, and you know how it's going to end right from the beginning. Whereas this one just kind of ends on an ellipsis at that point.
Yeah, and that's one of the things too. Speaking of greater than transcendence as a recognition, getting back to that, to understand, and this gets back to the Bergman thing, to understand why something is greater than making great, because we've seen in many arts, and I've shown this in many essays, dart tossing. If I've got 1,000 darts and I'm blind and drunk and I'm throwing boom, boom, and all 1,000. There's maybe a 1 in 2, 1 in 3 chance that maybe one of those darts is going to be an actual bullseye. That doesn't mean it's replicable. One of the greatest things I've ever done is shown how art you can repeatedly get a consistency of near greatness or greatness by following certain techniques. If you have the talent and you persevere, without doing either of those things, there's no formula. But and when I say that you can get it repeatedly, I'm not advocating doing a formula, but when you're looking at something, if you're doing something, you parallax something narratively. In the poetry itself poem, there is the feeling beside that which is felt. Right there, that first line, you've got something that is it disturbs your natural thinking. There's the feeling beside that which is felt. So there's feeling, and then there's feeling that's beside it, something aside it, as if a great artwork beyond consciousness, something that's maybe in the unconscious, whether gazing at church tower, and then it ends. And then this, the love of a life of it, so strangely itself like you, I know nothing of you. So we're going from the sort of haze to the more specific, then as if newly formed and felt unexpectedly, period. And it isn't an ellipsis, it's an implied ellipsis, but it is, I didn't make it an ellipsis for a reason, because unexpectedly is the most important word in that poem. It's got its own line.
I did not mean ellipsis in a literal sense.
Yeah.
It just kind of ends.
And felt unexpectedly.
It doesn't necessarily go.
And you put on the edge, unexpectedly what? And you're right. Even most great poets, Rilke, for example, his greatest poems, whether it's about swans, or it's about the tiger or the panther, or it's about some of the sonnets to Orpheus, you get sort of, if you were to make films of Rilke poems, there would be a mist, and then something would congeal out of the mist, and it would come, and it would do something, and it would do something a little bit off, a little bit unexpectedly, and then it would sort of dissolve back into the mist, and that's sort of the Rilke formula in a sense. And I'm being a little unfair because he didn't do that in all of his great poems, but that's sort of the Rilke trope. Whitman has those kinds of tropes.
Well, there's also the fact in his long extended poems, which are a little more complex than that, like Dino elegies, they may not just come out of the mist and then reformulate after it, but they have the same basic idea. And it's kind of, he'll have ugly images in there like death and everything. And he'll make it beautiful in a way. That is the Rilke trademark. And it's something that he does over and again. And he really had very little diversity, though, to the arc of his development.
Someone like Yeats also.
He's kind of like Pablo Neruda, though, in that he's a Jekyll and Hyde kind of poet.
Yeah, well, his early
he could write absolutely horrid poems, and then he could write masterful, long extended philosophic poems.
Yeah, his early poems were pretty much crap.
Well, even after that, he was very hit and miss, just like Neruda was. But Neruda is more, you can take his love poems here, and then you can take his political shit there. Yeats was up and down no matter what the subject was.
Yeah, and that gets back to the thing about recognizing it. These guys probably didn't recognize the constituent elements that went into making that poem great. And this is why it's important to be a critic. This is why it's important to read other people. And this is why it's important to recognize what makes a poem great, or what makes any artwork great, so that you can see the elements. Maybe the thing that makes something great isn't the technical stuff, but the way something is framed against something else. Not literally framed, but you may have, say, in some of the great Hudson River School painters, you may have a volcano in the background miles away, and then in the foreground you see a little man and his donkey, and maybe he's feeding him a carrot or something, doing some little diurnal task to get along. Meanwhile, the earth is bellowing far away. So you get that contrast, and that's what makes a painting like that great.
I would also argue that in the Hudson River School paintings, well, there are differences between Cole and Church and Verstadt. You could take those paintings and put them side by side, and there's similar approaches. Whereas with you, and perhaps a few others that may be exception, your poems, you could take them side by side, and they'd be completely indistinguishable from the other one in style. Even these three great painters you can put them side by side, and they have a similar quality to them. They have the same thing where the foreground, where in the background there's a character, and then there's all this immensity surrounding them.
Well, Cole was more didactic. Cole, his paintings used more classic illusions within the natural setting. Frederick Edwin Church was more like a nature documentarian, looking at the things themselves. And Bierstadt was more sort of the opera of nature, the cathedral of nature. And then you have other ones like Jasper Cropsey and a few other guys who were a little bit less iterations. But yeah, and that's one of the things too is you have to not only recognize what the greatness is, but again you have to do things differently. You can't just fall back into the same rhythms, the same patterns. You know, the next book that I'm going to do after this spy book, I'm not going to do the third book of my heroic trilogy. I'm going to do probably a small book that'll probably be only 100, 120,000 words. And it's going to be on this pro wrestler named Gorgeous George from the 1940s or 50s. I've never done the 1940s or 50s as a whole book, but the thing that I'm going to do is it's going to be told, the main narrative is going to be told from the perspective of his second wife in a short, brief period of his life. He only lived like 45, 50 years, 1915, no, 48 years, so just under 50 years. And it's going to be in the late 40s to maybe early 50s when he was the star of television. I mean, pro wrestling, before sitcoms came along in the late 40s, the first 4 or 5 years of television were basically just local newscasts, Uncle Milty kind of crap, and Milton Berle, sort of variety shows, and a few game shows and pro wrestling. So Gorgeous George was a name. I mean, he was on par with a Tom Cruise today in terms of when people talk about name. This guy was, and he was never a big champion in any of the wrestling things, but he was the first guy who put on wrestling and played a character, a bad guy. He played this narcissistic, quasi feminine male character, and it's interesting. And so I'm going to have the main narrative be narrated by his wife, but there's going to be no conversations in it. I'm going to have 12 to 15 or 20 conversations that are going to be called mirrors. And the mirrors will be when George actually speaks in the first person, talking to someone. For example, he famously gave advice to Cassius Clay on how to basically be an asshole to get people to come pay. And other people, he was friends with Bob Hope and other people. So there's another example where I'm in the books. I'm always trying to do something different so that I'm not doing the same thing. I'll have long, deep conversations in that book, but if there's going to be the pull between the narrative being told by his second wife, wherein we're not going to know what George is thinking, we're only going to see her version of him, and then the times when we see George, but we're only going to see him in specific context in conversations with other people. Now, here's the question. Hold on. Keep your thought. The point I'm trying to make by saying this is, where are all of these fucking writers? And I was just looking through some writings of people like some of these Japanese writers Jessica loves, and I was also looking through like the Border trilogy of Cormac McCarthy. I don't see anything like that to play with perspective, to play with ideas and whatnot. And so here's a book that I'm just planning to do probably sometime late this year or early next year, whenever I get the chance, depending on when I get a job or whatnot. But all of these people who are in academia, who get all of this time off, all of this obscene pay, all of these MFA accolades, they can just get anything published because they've got an MFA after their name. Why aren't they fucking even trying? Forget about whether they could write as well as me. They ain't going to be able to do it. But why don't they even try to put things in an interesting perspective, to try to formulate a narrative out of these things? Like I said, this book I'm doing now is 23 sort of tattered banners of a narrative that the reader is going to have to collate themselves. This next book that I'm going to do is I'm putting a tension right there between a first person and third person, between a wife and a husband's viewpoints and whatnot. These are the ways to get into something in different ways, that you don't repeat yourself, and that it forces you to grow. So that now, when I do books after these two books, that this book I'm doing now and the next book, I have a greater palette of colors, so to speak, to narratively tell things. I can do things. Not only that, but if I do finally start writing plays, I can take some of these techniques into plays. And if I go back to writing poetry, I can take that into poetry. These most writers, though, they basically don't get beyond even the primary colors.